Like, there's no point in looking back. Those people are dead, 1960 people. What survives is the idea. And if we're not prepared to hold the idea up, they will have died in vain. Well, I grew up in a house where 1916 was central to what it was believed it meant to be Irish. Okay, both my parents had a kind of an iconic regard for the 1916 figures, and the house was. The library of the house, if I can call it, was that. It only had two things. It had sports books and books about that period. And right across the range of, like, you had the jail journals, right? And you had my fight for Irish freedom, and you had my guerrilla days in Ireland, and people will know the authors of those and so on, you know. But they're just a sample of what they were, you know. And the debate around the table then always sprung from that kind of thing. So I grew up with that kind of respect for those people. It was probably uncritical, but that was because they had formulated their views, so they, you know, but they would debate and defend them vigorously with other people and that, you know. So it's a thing I want to do at the 100th anniversary. I want to walk into the GPO and just take that in for a minute on the 100th anniversary, you know. My father wasn't involved in the 1916 rising. No, what he was he was actually 4th Northern Division Old IRA, 1916 to 1923. Now, he would have been a very young man. He'd have been 17, 18 at that time. And he grew up on the Bellingham estate in Castle Bellingham, which was Sir Henry Bellingham, right? And his father was the coachman to the Bellingham estate. And it transpired that they were lucky in that Sir Henry Bellingham had a great regard for all things Irish. I think it's recounted that Pádraig Pearse attended a cultural festival on the Bellingham estate. And I think that was the only occasion my father ever met Pádraig Pearse. Okay. And an interesting, because it's the decade of centenaries, an interesting thing is that my father actually left one of the younger Bellinghams to the railway station in Dundalk to join up in the First World War. And he turned to Daddy and said, "Martin, whatever you do not get involved in this war. This is not your war." And that's an interesting thing, that somebody from the Anglo class could analyse the situation in that way. You see, so all of that was in the background. I, of course, didn't remember anything about. I'm only taking this from, you see. I've read frequently in certain sort of media outlets that the 1966 celebration was triumphalist. You see, now to me it was nothing of the kind. Nothing of the kind, okay. What it did involve as part of it was the kind of military processions, okay, which seemed to me logical in terms of, especially in the international context at that time. If you consider all the great national displays, if you take Russia with their great military displays on an annual basis, but this was 50th anniversary, celebrating the fact that we had our own army. Ireland was involved in the peacekeeping quite a lot throughout the world. So the Irish Army actually represented the kind of independent nationhood. And it seemed to me very appropriate that that be recognised as part of the celebration, because it wasn't by any means all of it. Okay, so I didn't see it as triumphalism. I just saw it as a kind of a self-reflection of where we had come to. Okay, now, and so I'd like to see a military presence in the 2016 Rising for the same reason. Okay, but what I do think is largely is an element that's perhaps not emphasised enough, and I've heard the question asked here, were they aware that apart from independence that they were actually anti-imperial? And that question seems to me the question itself displays a lack of understanding of what they were doing, because the core question they were asking was, is the Irish way of being best reflected by being part of the engine of an empire, or is it best reflected by our own individual nationhood? And so they were actually inimicable to empire, and that was proved by the actual executions, because the empire responded by saying that is intolerable to an empire. So of course they were anti-imperial. That was the core of what they were doing. So to have to ask the question is to misunderstand the core of what they were doing. Now that's my view. That's my view. Sorry, that's so you see. So, and that's how I see it. And what I have a problem with in the 2016 celebrations now are that we're reflecting power to power. In other words, we had a most interesting discussion here, and it was about leaders after empire. Okay. What needs to go along with that is a discussion with people who have suffered the colonial experience and haven't got to that point. Right. So if you take around the world, if you take the First Nations people of North America, if you take the Aboriginals of Australia, to ask them about freedom in the context of the Irish Revolution, where they said it's not only about being free but being Gaelic, it's not only about being Gaelic, it's about being free. Now, that's not a narrow construct that's often put on it by people, because if you think of the Aboriginal people, it's not only been Aboriginal, it's been free. It's not only been free, it's been Aboriginal. Doesn't mean other people have to be that way. Doesn't mean everyone in your community has to be that way. But it means that that pathway has to be open, and it's not open for all those people. And I think we should be addressing that. That's my view. Well, I think there should be some form. There should be some form of an actual get-together organised in Ireland, a kind of a forum, a symposium of peoples, where representatives from all these cultures who may be now a cultural space without a place. And that was even addressed by President Mbeki, because he talked about the constitution there, where there was no question of ceding territory to the Afrikaners, but the constitution had to preserve their cultural space. And that's the key, because like in Australia, the Aboriginals have been said sorry to, but that's where it ends, right? So there should be a forum where people can get together, and I think Ireland, because of the nature of the 16 Rising and because of the position we've adopted in terms of being basically neutral between great powers, puts us in a unique position to do that. And I think that should be actually part of the celebration this year. And I think if that doesn't happen, there's a flaw, both culturally and socio-politically. I don't believe anybody should ever be forgotten. Okay, don't believe that, okay? What I believe is that it's really important that context be understood, because if you can agree context, you can generally agree the content. Okay. Now the context of the Somme and the context of 1916, it's part of the difficulty. Like, this is a huge question, okay? The losses which in particular the unionist community would have suffered in the Somme, and this was addressed by, I think, Tom McGurk in an article a couple of years back, but the take-up in the Second World War from the unionist community as a result of the losses in the Somme was greatly reduced, okay? And I don't know whether De Valera's campaign to not have conscription in what I'm going to call the 6 counties had an impact on achieving that as well. But I do believe that the 1916 Rising had at its core the message, which was that central question. You had the Redmondites who seemed to say, look, we're going to fight this war together, and that's going to advance the agenda for home rule. You had the unionist community, or the Anglo-Irish community, who said, we're going to fight this war in defence of the empire, and afterwards that's going to increase our power. Okay, and you had the 1916 people who said, we're not involving in any imperial war on any side, and the only war that we will enter into is the one that says that our way of being is being oppressed and we want out of there. And so I think it's in that context that you look at it, and I cannot see, like, I have a personal preference for people who walked into their own main street of their own city, stood out and said what we're fighting for, and went back in and fought for it. I have a preference for that than an imperial war. But that's me, you see. So I do believe that this year should be about 1916. And the First World War went on from 14 to 18, and there's plenty of time for the context of that over that period. But I think 2016 should be about 1916. But I also think it should actually be looking forward and not looking back. And that's why I made that point about these other communities, because it should be a staging post, a reflection on, what's the next 100 years hold for people who have suffered the colonial experience and that haven't exited it. The leaders had all exited it, but there are so many places around the world. And there is then the other question of, what does colonialism look like in the 21st century as distinct from what it looked like? What's global financial colonialism? What's corporate colonialism? And what's the resistance movement to that? And I think those are the questions. Like, there's no point in looking back. Those people are dead, 1916 people. What survives is the idea. And if we're not prepared to hold the idea up, they will have died in vain if we don't look at the idea and see where it's taken us. That's my view.